In this lesson, we will briefly review how to conjugate regular verbs that are in the ere and ire forms in the infinitive, as well as looking at some irregular verbs with the ere endings. First, let's look at scrivere and dormire as examples of how to conjugate regular ire verbs. In the case of scrivere, you remove the ere ending that goes with the infinitive, and you're left with the base scriv. And then you add the regular endings for present tense verbs that are regular in the ere form. O, I, e, iamo, ete, ono. Similar for ire verbs, ire verbs, remove the ire infinitive endings and you're left with the root dorm. Then add the regular endings for present tense ire verbs. O, I, e, iamo, ite, ono. As you can see, the only difference between the ire and ere conjugations is in the voi form. For ire verbs, you have the ite ending. For ere verbs, you have the ete ending. Other than that, their endings are identical for ire and ere verbs. Now let's take a look at some irregular ere and ire verbs. First, we have our ere verbs, bere, dovere, potere, and volere. If we were to follow the regular pattern for bere, we would remove the ere ending and we would be left with just the letter B as a root. And then we would add the regular endings. For yo, it's the O, so we would end up with bo. For tu, it would be B. But as you can see, this is not the case. The verb is irregular. It doesn't follow the usual pattern. And the conjugations are io bevo, tu bevi, lui lei beve, noi beviamo, voi bevete, e loro bevono. For dovere, you can see that the O, if you removed the ere ending, you would be left with dov, dove, as a root. But you can see that for most of the conjugations, that O switches to an E, as the verb is irregular. It does maintain in the noi and voi forms, but there are still some irregularities. Io devo, tu devi, lui lei deve, noi dobbiamo, voi dovete, e loro devono. And for potere, you can see if we removed ere, we'd be left with pot as our root, but as you can see again, that's not the case. Io posso, tu puoi, lui lei può, noi possiamo, voi potete, e loro possono. And volere, io voglio, tu vuoi, lei, lui vuole, noi vogliamo, voi volete, e loro vogliono. As you can see with irregular verbs, sometimes the conjugated form of the verb doesn't resemble the infinitive form like you would expect, and sometimes you don't recognize it as being a conjugated form of that verb. If you saw the word vogliamo, you might not automatically relate it to the infinitive verb volere, even if you knew that volere was to want. So my best advice when you're first getting to know these irregular verbs is to memorize them. Everyone has different tricks. I usually just repeat the entire conjugation over and over till it sounds very familiar. For example, with potere, posso, puoi, può, possiamo, potete, possono. If you say that over and over a lot of times, it'll start to cement in your mind, but you might have other tricks. Eventually, it'll become more automatic, but in the beginning, with irregular verbs, since they don't follow a particular given pattern, memorization is usually helpful. Here are some irregular ire verbs, dire, uscire, and venire. As you can see, dire takes on a C that's not in the root. Uscire is somewhat irregular as well, and venire. So again, I would memorize these. Dico, dici, dice, diciamo, dite, dicono. Esco, esci, esce. Usciamo, uscite, escono. Vengo, vieni, viene, veniamo, venite, and vengono. Here I have an example with the verb dire, to say, in the lui lei form. Mia figlia, Agata, dice sempre perché, perché. Then we have two verbs that are both irregular, two ere verbs that are both irregular, sapere and conoscere, and these two verbs in English are both translated as to know, but in Italian they have very different meanings. First, let's look at the conjugations. Sapere conjugates as so, sai, sa, sappiamo, sapete, sanno, and conoscere translates as conosco, conosci, conjugates as conosco, conosci, conosce, conosciamo, conoscete, and conoscono. So first let's look at sapere. Obviously translates as to know, but it has a different use than conoscere, which also translates as to know. Sapere is used to talk about something you know how to do or a fact that you know. For example, lui sa cucinare bene. He knows how to cook. Or noi non sappiamo chi è. We don't know who that is. So here you have an example of knowing how to do something and knowing a fact or knowing information. Conoscere translates more as to be familiar with. It could be to be familiar with something, like conosci la musica siciliana? Do you know Sicilian music? Are you familiar with Sicilian music? Or to be familiar with someone. Pina conosce mia cugina. Pina knows my cousin. She's familiar with her. Or it could be to be familiar with a place. I miei zii conoscono l'Italia. My uncles know Italy. They're familiar with Italy. Conoscere can also be used to talk about meeting someone. In my example, voi conoscere mia zia? Would you like to meet my aunt? And it's also used commonly in the past tense to talk about when you first met someone. In this screen, we're going to look briefly at your comprehension of sapere and conoscere. Quanto capisci? How much do you understand? So take a look at these examples and decide if you should use conoscere or sapere. So to review, conoscere is used to describe being familiar with a person, a place, or a thing, and is also used to describe meeting someone. Sapere is used to describe knowing a fact or knowing how to do something. So take a look at these examples and decide which to use. And here we have our answers. Io conosco l'Italia. I know Italy in the sense of I'm familiar with Italy. Tu sai che ore sono? Do you know what time it is? Here we're talking about knowing information or knowing a fact. So we would use sapere. Loro sanno ballare tango. They know how to dance tango. So in this case, knowing how to do something. Voglio conoscere tua moglie. I want to meet your wife. So in this case, conoscere is describing meeting someone for the first time. I hope you found this brief video introduction to irregular ere and ire verbs useful, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Ciao a tutti!